can I welcome you to this last of a series of 5 talks that I've been privileged to share with you. This is rather different in that it's telling you the story of my own woodland, which I bought 35 years ago. And it's a story, if you like, about stewardship of the countryside, but I'll let you draw that conclusion at the end. But it's really appropriate that we talk about woodlands today, because today in the life of our nation, particularly in England, we are launching the England Trees Action Plan, which is the biggest government initiative on trees, woodlands and forests in our country for at least a generation. And you will see quite a lot in the press about initiatives like the Queen has launched her Treebilly to celebrate her platinum anniversary, Jubilee. But this today certainly is a really good initiative where the new planting will treble in the next few years. There will be lots of other initiatives so that our forest and woodland cover will increase. So it's really good to be able to talk about a woodland with you today. My woodland's called North Down Plantation, and there you can see it, a lovely winter scene at my entrance. And at the entrance, behind where I'm standing to take this picture, is a lane. And you would be surprised at who comes along that lane. And very early in my ownership of the wood back in the 1980s, I heard this clip clop coming along the lane, and there were 2 horses and a lovely caravan, and you can't quite see Melvin, who's sitting just behind the horses. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee, and I'd got to know Melvin a little bit as one of my neighbours, and I shouted to Melvin, "Hey Melvin, have you got time for a coffee?" Now, I want you to believe what I now say. He, with his horses, was coming along at about 1.5 miles per hour. If I slow right down in my talk, you will get the impression of how quickly or how slowly they were going. Anyway, I shouted to Melvin, "Time for coffee." And he replied, "Sorry, can't stop. They're a bit frisky." So there you are, all the different experiences that you have. But if we go down into the wood, from that gate where you saw the picture of the snow, it goes through a lovely main track. You've got birch on the right, 1 or 2 pines and birch there in the picture on the left. And at the bottom is the London to Southampton railway line. And this is one of the old trains, the spam cans that I think are used, I'm not quite sure what they call them. I'm not really a train buff. And 2 of my sons watching the train. Now, the one with the reddish orange top, Stephen, he is now 41, and Ben is in his late 30s. So you realize how long ago that picture was taken, and the train is going down to Micheldever, then Winchester, and on and so on. So at the top of the wood, I've got a lane. Down at the bottom, I've got a major railway line, the London-Southampton line. And as I told you, I bought the wood in 1985 with my brother-in-law, my late wife, the lady there in the middle next to her father, my brother-in-law in red, and my 3 boys. And we purchased it from the Forestry Commission. We bought out the Forestry Commission's lease, because many of the lands owned by you as taxpayers were originally bought by your Forest Service, the Forestry Commission, on a long lease, so that they could grow trees, but the owner of the land would still have access for hunting and other things. Now, what we mean by a long lease is not 99 years, but 999 years. And what Margaret and I did when we bought this wood was to buy out the residue of the Forestry Commission's lease, which was another 967 years, which we thought would probably be long enough. Since then, we've actually bought the freehold as well. My wife has just mentioned to me that the picture of Margaret you can see in this picture, that is my late wife. She died very suddenly at the age of 55, and then I remarried a Margaret. So I've been blessed by two Margarets in my life as my wives. When we bought the wood, this is what it looked like. There were 3 rows of pine and 3 rows of beech, and 1 row of the pine that you can see had been cut out. It's called a line thinning. And over the years, we have done further thinnings. And what thinning is to remove the poor trees to help the better ones grow well. And this bunch of characters, they came into the wood as firewood merchants, firewood contractors from the town of Reading. And they worked through, and I'd marked the sorts of trees I wanted to cut out. And here is some of their produce. You can see the logs there on the right and all the lovely string bags there on the left. And if you looked at the label, the white and yellow label, you would have read a very interesting sign, which said something like firewood logs from a neglected, uncared for woodland or something like that. Well, thank you very much, I said to them. You didn't ask me whether you could label it like that, but if it helped their sales, well, that's no problem at all. But there we are. So they did some work thinning through the poorer quality material. But you've probably, many of you have heard the Great Storm of 1987. Well, it was the storm of 1990, the Burns Night storms, all across southern England that actually did a lot of damage in my own wood. And by the way, I should have explained that my woodland's in North Hampshire, about 7 miles west of Basingstoke. And many of the pine trees that have been growing were blown down, and we decided to clear all the pines over the next 2 years. And I put them on the market and I sold the trees what we call standing. That is, you mark the trees you want to have cut out, then the contractor or the buyer comes in and cuts down all the trees to take to market. And he paid us some money for these trees. And this is some of the equipment that he brought in. It's a tracked vehicle that you can see there on the right. And it's got this great long arm that kind of grabs the tree, hugs the tree, and it works up the trunk, cutting off the branches and cutting off log lengths of the desired size. Now, I was marketing around 2,500 pine trees like this, and his equipment worked through all that number in the space of 7 or 8 working days. And they were put onto the market. And here is a picture of them. You can see North Down Plantation there on the left. And here are the logs at the entrance, ready to go off to industry in the Midlands. And you can see the tractor. It had to carry the logs from where they were cut up or cut down and then sectioned into length and brought them here to the entrance. And I've written 2 books about my wood, one called A Wood of Our Own. And my son, Stephen, the one who had the red top looking at the railway line, he actually is quite an accomplished artist. And at the age of 15, got A-level in art. And this is his sketch of that picture. And as the proud dad, of course, I wanted to show it to you all, to show what a lovely picture he has done to illustrate that extraction of timber. And that is what the wood looked like after all the pines had been cut out. There had been 2 rows of pine, 3 rows of beech, 2 rows of pine, and so on. And you can see the pine foliage there in the foreground. And you can see Stephen on the left, son Ben on the right, and a friend David in the middle. And sort of great sort of avenue between the beeches. And in the wintertime, there again is that swathe between the beech trees. And what the pines have done is very interesting. They have helped the beeches grow. They provided shelter for the beeches because the pines grew a little bit faster, but also by selling the timber from those pines, I was able to recoup much, but not all, of the investment in buying the wood a number of years earlier. And so in many ways, it has been a win-win. Now, I don't know how many of you are into tax affairs and that side of life, but when you manage a wood commercially as a private owner, it is outside the taxation environment. I didn't have to pay tax on the income from the pine trees that I sold. Because forestry is such a long-term business, and because you'll never earn enough money to go around the world and do all those wonderful things from growing trees, this is one of the ways that the government incentivizes the growing of timber in our country, because you're talking of rotations of 50, 80, 100, 150 years from planting to cutting. So we've begun the process of thinning. The pines have gone, and since then I have thinned out the beech trees every so often, about every 6 or 7 years, and then every 8 or 9 years, always favouring the better trees, taking out the poorer ones. And here's a rather grubby, muddy, wet, cold winter's day picture of some further logging of the beech trees. But this is now what the woodland is becoming to look like. That was actually taken about 10 years ago, this picture. You're beginning to see a lovely beech woodland with not even a hint of those rows and how it used to look. And there we've done some more thinning. This was it back in 2012, was the last major thinning of the beech, and we're due to do another one in the next couple of years. And that really is what the woodland is now looking like today. And indeed, if you came this month, in our cold, wet May, the leaves are just coming out. It is breathtaking to see how beautiful it is, and this part of God's creation, and the privilege I enjoy as its owner to be a good steward or custodian of this part of our countryside. The thinnings need to continue because the beech trees are now in their 60s, they're 64 years old, and they'll be really big enough and ready for a final felling, if that's the way we do it, long after I'm dead, when they're about 100 years old. But we're well on to producing a beautiful woodland. Now, in case you're wondering if everything is so hunky-dory, what a wonderful thing to do, it's not all plain sailing. Here's that same picture I took you've just seen, but an autumn view. Because I have problems as well as a manager. Now, if I was speaking to you face to face, I'd ask you to suggest what has caused that damage. What has caused the bark to be stripped off? You can see the root right in the middle of the picture where the stripping is done a few days ago. On the left-hand side, probably about a week or 10 days ago. And on the right, you've got a grey piece, which was stripping of the previous year. Now, I expect you're thinking of possible animals. Is it deer? Is it rabbit? Well, no, it is grey squirrel that has done that damage. And the time it would take a grey squirrel to debark that strip, it's what, about 6-8 inches long, half the size of your hand. It would do that in about 30 seconds. It just tears bits of bark off about the size of a postage stamp and spits them out, tears and spits them out. We think it does it perhaps for some nutrient, but more likely, because we know it's young male squirrels that do this damage, as a displacement activity. Think of it like sort of chewing your fingernails when you're anxious and that sort of thing. So that is squirrel damage. And I get a lot of that in the wood. Well, I try to control the squirrels, I'll mention in a moment. If it was rabbit damage, and this is not in my wood, it would look more like this, rather than that picture of squirrel damage there. But squirrel damage is probably the biggest threat to the health and well-being of our broadleaf trees like oak and beech, sycamore and so on in the lowlands of our country. Now, squirrel damage is lethal if the animal strips the bark all the way round the tree, so cutting off the top of the tree from the nutrients and the moisture. And here is a cross section of a tree where you can see the bark has been almost completely stripped off. That's the black ring that there is in the middle of that tree, but it wasn't a completely continuous ringing around the tree, and the tree was able to recover. And on the outside, there was nothing to show that inside the tree, there was all this damage had taken place 20, 30 years earlier. And I just thought of illustrate that. So serious have squirrels been that back in the 1960s, it was even the subject of a cabinet meeting discussion. And I'm sure many of you will recognize this is John White's sketch of Harold Macmillan there holding the squirrel tail. And I don't know whether the other members of his cabinet are faithfully reproduced, but anyway, there was a lot of concern. As you know, the grey squirrel is a pest by law definition because of the scourge that it is to our trees in this country. What do squirrels' nests look like? Well, here's an example of one just near the tree trunk, that great round thing. It's called a drey, D-R-E-Y. Usually they're at the center of a tree like that. And every year, usually on 2 occasions for about a week or 10 days at a time, in February, early March, and then in late April, early May, I will do some squirrel control to try to reduce the numbers of squirrels in my wood by 20 or 30. There are various legal means of doing that, and I'll quickly show you a picture of one of the legal means that is a humane trap that instantly kills the squirrel, but I won't dwell on it for the squeamish. It's not only squirrels that one has to contend with, but they are by far my main management involvement in the wood at this time of year, where I have to do the 2 trapping sessions. I get a little bit of damage. This is just an example of a bacterial slime down a beech tree. The odd tree suffers a little bit from chlorosis, but it's relatively unimportant. Much more important that many of you will have heard about is ash dieback. Now, this is in young trees here. They're only 1 or 2 years old, but you can see here in June, the trees, I took this 2 years ago, the middle one is blackened. There's another one on the left-hand side, its leaves are beginning to wilt. And this is the scourge of ash dieback that is spreading all through our country. We are not quite as worried as we were 5 or 6 years ago, that it would simply go through all our ash trees and kill the lot in a very short time. Clearly, the damage is taking a longer time to work through the population. And we do think something like 1 tree in 15, 1 in 20 is showing some tolerance of the disease. But it certainly is a really nasty disease. Perhaps not quite as awful as Dutch elm disease was back in the 1950s and 60s, but certainly is a serious threat. And we are seeing more and more pests and diseases in Britain because mainly from the import of so many plants into our garden centres that provide a way of bringing in pests and diseases that don't naturally occur here. Also, climate change causing some more stress makes them more vulnerable as well. We are a very windy country, as you all know. Indeed, a wonderful statistic for you to think about is that we are the 5th windiest country in the world in terms of average wind speed. Why? We're an island on the western end of a massive landmass, the Eurasian continent, and that's why we're so windy. And of course, we get storms, and here's just an oak tree that's had its top blown out. So I have squirrels to contend with. There are pest and disease issues to take note of, and there's things like storms. But I guess the saddest problem to cope with as a woodland owner is in this picture. And it was my neighbour who runs a lovely organic market garden who rang me one day and said, "Julian, I've been going past your entrance and there's something odd." And he said, "I stopped the other day and went and had a look and realized that what was odd was your big gate's gone." I thought you were just working in the wood and the gate was open. And there you can see you've got the small gate on the left and then a gap. And if you go inside, there you can see the gate is missing. You can see its bottom hinge on the left, but its top hinge, you can just see where it was. And indeed, the top hinge was neatly placed at the bottom, and somebody had removed the big gate. It was a few months old and was clearly stolen by someone. And it is the informal damage like that that saddens one most. It's not a big issue. Even the wretched problem of fly tipping, in my 35 years of ownership, I've really only had 3 or 4 examples, and this was the worst, and that was about 4 years ago. Unfortunately, Network Rail, but that's another story, were able to help me get rid of it all. So I don't drive over the wood worrying, will I see fly tipping? It is simply a fact of life as an owner. There are these people who will do this kind of destruction. And it just saddens. One is upset by squirrel damage and other disease and pests, but it is saddened that one's fellow humans will do this and cause these problems. Well, something I was discussing with our host, Julian Pym, was the possibility that if some of you are interested, I can give you a guided tour around my wood. And we'll talk about that near the end. But if you do, I will warn you all that if you come in the summer, you must watch out for this beastie. Now, this is a much magnified version. And if I was asking you, and we were in a face-to-face to make suggestions what it is, usually 1 or 2 of you, particularly if you've got dogs and you go walking and so on, will recognize it as a tick. And we get lots of ticks in the wood. There have been deer through the wood as well as other wildlife, although I now have it deer fenced. But even so, we still get ticks. And in the summertime, the tick will climb up to the top of a bit of grass or vegetation. And as you walk through the vegetation, it attaches to your trousers, to your clothes, and eventually will find some soft spot on your body in which to try and suck blood. I've never had tick fever, never had the much nastier Lyme disease, though most times I visit the wood, we will find the odd tick on us that we need to check. So that's just kind of one of those health and safety things, really. Now, so far, all I've been talking about in my wood is the main block that you can see right in the middle of that picture. This is a 1911 6-inch to the mile map where you've got Northdown Plantation. You can see the railway on the right-hand side, the narrow lane at the top. And when we first bought the wood, there was a strip that we didn't have access to right down at the bottom. And being a research scientist, when we planted up this strip of land, when we gained access to it, I used the latest research discovery of back in the 1980s, early 80s, of these plastic cubes called tree shelters. And we planted a mix of cherry trees, a few cherries, a few oaks, and a lot of ash trees. And here's just an example of a friend of mine showing how you need to split these plastic cubes. The early ones that were made didn't break down naturally. They had far too much ultraviolet inhibitor in the plastic, and so we had to split them because, particularly with cherry, it damaged the tree quite badly. We had the plastic cubes to protect the trees against browsing from deer, from rabbits, from hares, and also so that we could control weeds in the immediate vicinity. But also on this site, we had a lot of old man's beard, traveler's joy, clematis, our native clematis. And here you can see the picture. And when I was writing my first book about the wood, called A Wood of Our Own, that was published by Oxford University Press, John White, my artist friend, did a lovely picture showing the young trees that we had planted at the bottom of the wood with all the clematis. You can see it there, as it were, almost like smoke going through those trees. And up at the top, he drew the tassels and the flowers that give it its name, Old Man's Beard, in the wintertime. it's a real problem how to cope with this climber, because it can overwhelm trees, and a lot of effort was spent when we were planting up this area and looking after it in the early years, how to get on top of it. But unbeknown to me, when my publisher, Oxford University Press, brought out the book A Wood of Our Own, they were so taken by the two little pictures at the top left of the tassels and the flowers that on every heading to every page, you know how on the top of the page of a book you'll have chapter, and you'll often then have the name of the chapter, chapter number, and then on the other side the chapter name. On either side of those, they actually had these little items. What would you call them? As kind of little icons, little images. Anyway, not quite sure what the technical word is. And so on every page of the book that I read about my own wood, I'm reminded about the plant that has caused me one of the biggest problems in its management. And I just smile wryly at that thought. Anyway, moving on, we planted ash trees and oaks and a few wild cherry. And here you can see the trees when they're about 14, 15 years old. And they are now beginning their stage in thinning, just like the big beech trees we saw earlier on. These are now being thinned. But the produce from this thinning goes to our own wood burning stove, or I sell a little bit as local firewood. And here you can see how we thinned the trees out. And some of the stacks of firewood. Now, if you can see behind me, my wife is going to stand up and she's going to show you her muscles. Can you? I hope you can all see Margaret showing you her muscles. That is because all those logs you can see in that picture, she has carried every one. I have to do the tree felling, properly kitted out with all the hat and the ear defenders and the mask and all the rest of it. But Margaret, when the logs are not too big, she actually carries them. Normally, of course, if you were an audience, you would applaud and smile and shout and do all those sorts of things. But hey, this is a virtual talk, not not one face to face. But yeah, and of course, we now continue to work this patch of woodland. The sad thing is that most of the ash in this woodland have now got ash dieback. And so I'm so grateful that I was sensible enough to put in some oaks and some wild cherry as well. And so I'm having to manage that with a view to coping with the ash dieback. And there's a picture of me taken just a few weeks ago, well, back in the winter time, cutting this year's firewood. And you can see we're still doing that work there. So that's North Down Plantation that we wandered around. You can see to the top, probably I'll point it out if I could, but I can only just show there's a little bit of woodland which has got the word oak marked on it, just to the top of North Down Plantation, and there's a sort of a white triangular bit. And this was a patch of woodland that we didn't acquire initially, but we bought several years after the original block. And this is what it looked like. And it's bizarre. It's a patch of sycamore coppice with some large oak trees all along the edge and a few scattered through. And here's two of my oldest sons, John and Stephen, next to one of the oaks there. John White, my artist and forester, also came to it. And when we went through this patch of woodland, it was a kind of coppice with standards. The coppice was sycamore, the standards were oaks scattered through, but it hadn't been looked at, worked, thinned, for certainly all the time I'd owned the adjoining wood, probably for about 30 years. So of the 102 oak trees, we decided to cut 44 of them. And here's an example of one of them being cut. And I was amazed at the quality and the standard of the cutting. And you can just see that a little bit there. A lovely kind of 50p piece type shape, which is such a mark of good workmanship by these tree fellers. And there you can see another example there. But one of the oak trees, number 20, that came down looked different. And here you can see it is stained all the way across. And the staining is caused by the beefsteak fungus, Fistulina hepatica, and it causes the wood inside the tree to become stained in a rich, dark brown, called brown oak. Sorry? Oh, Margaret's actually given me, I don't know whether you can see this on the screen just next to me, if you can see my picture, and there is the bowl made from it. And it is a very valuable trunk, whereas, for example, that log might be worth £100. This one, with its brown oak staining, might be worth £1,500, because here is timber that is naturally stained, and those who restore Victorian furniture or even older furniture like Chippendale or something like that would want to restore it not with an artificial stain, but with a naturally stained wood, naturally darkened wood. And so brown oak, very special. After all the thinning we had done through that patch, this is what the woodland looks like. I've left some of the really old trees. There's regrowth coming up, and it's now rather more open. You will have appreciated, and we've got about another 10 minutes if that's all right, that one of the objectives of owning this woodland is to look after it well, but also for it to wash its face financially, to gain income from the sale of timber. But also an equally important objective is to promote wildlife, wildflowers especially, and also because the woodland is a mile, just 1 mile from the village of Steventon, where the novelist Jane Austen was born and grew up. And so keeping it as part of the character of our lovely countryside is equally as important as what I've been sharing about managing it as for timber. And just a picture of some snowdrops that we have in the wood, lots of lovely primroses, and what a good year. Our dry April and then our cold May has been, I think, for primroses and cowslips. And just another example of it, you can see a few shoots of dog's mercury as well, indicating the wood is really quite a chalky soil that we have. It's not a famous bluebell wood. I have a few patches of bluebells, but no, it's not a large carpeting of bluebells all through at all, because most of the wood is established on land that we think in the 1840s was rough pasture. Only a small part is what we call ancient woodland that's always been under woodland. But some interesting flowers that we have found here is a little group of a thing called Solomon's seal. You can see them a little bit better in the middle of that picture. It's in the lily family, and it's really quite special, confined in its natural distribution mainly to several counties of central southern England. So it's not terribly clear there's too much interference in the background from grass and from dog's mercury and nettles and so on. And similarly in this picture, which looks all like nettles, you've actually got my favorite woodland flower, which is the Yellow Archangel. And there it is. It's got leaves just like nettle, but they do not sting you. They're not the flowers of nettle, but a quite different plant called Yellow Archangel. Just like white dead nettle does not sting you, it's a quite different plant from the common nettle. And if you look at the flowers of one of these, it looks like a hooded angel. It's beautiful. Do take time if you come across some of these. And they are certainly at this time of year, April, May, June, you'll see clumps of this lovely Yellow Archangel. And it also indicates that the soil where it grows has probably never been under the plough, never been grazed. So it indicates an ancient soil. So how do we manage a woodland to encourage wildlife? Well, here is a glade, and also on the right you can see shrubs as well as big trees in the background, and its provision of variety, sun and shade, ground flora, low shrubs, tall shrubs, climbers, small trees, mature trees, trees that are dying, or dead trees standing, as well as dead wood. You're providing a range or a diversity of habitats so that you are blessed with the wonderful wildlife like this fritillary feeding on some bramble flowers. Lovely fritillaries that we get in the wood. There are several species of fritillary, but they're such glorious, almost 2 inches across, that the wingspan, Absolutely super, as well as lots of the common things like peacocks and red admirals. Occasionally I see white admiral butterflies as well. But not only do we have wonderful wildlife, but I don't know whether you can see these two strange fungi that are coming up with the dog's mercury. Here's a better picture of it. It's a morel, and you can eat morels. They really are quite favored. We haven't seen them recently. This was about 10 years ago, these morels, when we last saw them, but certainly they must be in the wood as an edible fungus. Other fungi, the lovely elf caps that we see early in the spring. Julian Pym was asking me about groups that come round the wood, and once a year I take some children, 5 to 8 year olds from Basingstoke. They're part of a wildlife group with their mums and dads, and we come and go around the wood in winter time to see what we can find. And we always go and look for the elves and pretend on the story there, they're elf caps, which are absolutely fun to be able to see. That's one or two other colourful things that many of you will recognise, that this is the fruit of lords and ladies, or dead man's finger, or cuckoo pint, whatever you like to call it as well. Time is now getting on. This is a printout of the, sorry, Margaret, can you remind me? Sorry, the what was done in the 1840s, when instead of giving the local vicars, oh gosh, sorry, it's gone from me. Tithing. Yes, these are the tithe records showing that part of my wood was once valued for its tithes by Francis William Digby. It says it should be Digweed, one of Jane Austen's friends. And so part of my wood was actually part of the Steventon estate, which Jane Austen's younger brother, Edward Knight, was responsible for a time. So a little bit of my wood, I think I can claim Jane Austen may have visited. I'll skip over that because time is now getting on. One bit of the wood which was never formally planted and was never part of the tithe records was just a piece of land that was left unused. It was not part of a farm, not part of the bit that the Forestry Commission had, and it simply became scrub in the 1960s because of the damage that myxomatosis did in eliminating rabbits from our countryside in the 1950s. A large number of woodlands grew up spontaneously. And here's an example. You've got the birch trees, you've got some hazel, there's some white beam there, there's some hawthorn coming up, and we're actually now doing some coppicing in it. They grew up spontaneously because the removal of the browsing pressure from rabbits occurred. Once you have your eye in for what we call myxomatosis woods, you can see them, but that's another story. There's my wife on the right, a friend from church, our church secretary on the left, who is helping doing some coppicing. And there you can see the coppice of hazel coming up underneath those birch trees. I'll skip on a bit. That's another example of showing you coppicing. What coppicing is, you simply cut the shoots, in this case hazel, back to ground level, and you rely on the new growth that comes up from the stumps to create your next crop of woodland. But look at this chap praising God as he is there in my wood. And one of my neighbours, the Armstrongs, who live just down the road, he was at art college and he said, "Julian, can I do a statue made out of," it was wire netting and mud, and he found a really clayey patch in the wood. But what a lovely picture. It lasted for a few years. I'm afraid all the mud is now washed off after all the rain and so on. But I just think that's super image of what he was able to sculpt as an art student there. We still do a little bit of planting. This is my wife's family, her father sitting down and her brother and his wife and their dogs. And we planted an oak tree, or at least Bill, Margaret's dad, planted an oak tree, where the acorns came from the stand that was planted to commemorate Her Majesty's coronation in 1953. So we now call the tree the Royal Oak, and it's continuing the genetics, probably of Windsor Great Park, that of all the trees that were there. But that's sort of a special planting. Also, we've named some parts of the wood after, in this case, after my mother. After she died, before she died, she actually helped me acquire the adjoining piece of woodland, and the plaque you can see displayed there on the left commemorates that fact. And here is my late wife and me, taken many, many years ago when the wood received an award from the Forestry Commission for combining timber production and environmental and ecological concerns in the way that I seek to do as its steward. And that's what that plaque shows. But as I've mentioned, my late wife died very suddenly at the age of 55. And so the best tree in the whole wood, this wonderful oak, which is a pollard, that means its branches were cut off at about 10 feet and allowed to regrow, we decided to name it after her. We are creating a woodland garden with some native daffodils and some snowdrops that you can see. There's also now quite a lot of wild garlic around it as well as the seat that is there on the left. And the plaque is now labelled, we now call the tree Mum's Oak. If you visit France, they are always naming important trees after dignitaries or events and so on. And it's something we don't do quite so much. I know the Queen plants lots of trees and we have a plaque to mark that, but we decided to name the best tree in the whole wood after my late wife and calling it Mum's Oak to commemorate her life in that way. Just finally, a few slides, what's been happening recently? Well, I showed you the railway line. A Network Rail decided they needed to upgrade the electricity supply to this line to build a new transformer. And they said, Julian, we need to build a new transformer on your land. And I also knew I had no choice because they could compulsorily purchase it under the law. But equally, I knew they had no choice. They had to come to me. And so we came to a nice amicable arrangement. I sold them about 1/10 of an acre of land. And I was really pleased that they rebuilt my main track through the wood. And this is what the equipment is showing. And this is how they went about doing it. And this is what they were installing on the right-hand side, this great big box on stilts. And that is the new transformer to upgrade the electricity supply. I've lost about 1/10 of an acre of hazel coppice just here, but otherwise it's on the right-hand side, the transformer is, yeah. Sorry, Margaret was one. I tend to get my lefts and rights muddled up sometimes, and she's really good at making sure I don't, particularly when I'm giving a talk. Well, the final surprise I want to share with you, we've had our 45 minutes, is one that I did not expect ever. And you can see a dog just on the left-hand side. You can see his red collar, and his name is Jack. And he has a wonderful nose, and his wonderful nose sniffs out truffles. You know, that special fungus that is a culinary delight to many. And the gentleman kneeling down runs the English Truffle Company, and they have located a number of woods in southern England where they will host events to find truffles, and you can go for a truffle hunting day. Not many woodlands have truffles. It turns out, I learned 4 years ago, that mine does. And here is the produce from one truffle hunt. And the truffles you can see on that plate is probably worth £2,000. Not to me as the owner. I only get so much a person who comes, so I just get a small amount. But here is truffle hunting taking place. And so that's been an interesting little bit of income. And by the way, the income I do get and my brother-in-law gets from the truffle hunting, I of course have to declare on my tax return, which I've just done a few weeks ago, or a few days ago actually, because that's not part of growing trees. But that was an interesting surprise. The wood is full of surprises as its owner and its manager. And for me as a Christian, I sum it all up that God has entrusted to me this 30 acres to be a good steward, so that it is useful and profitable and it provides products to benefit us all, but to do it in ways that are sustainable, to use a current term, to use in a ways that will mean that I pass it on to my sons and future generations in an even better condition than when I received it. And that surely is what being custodians or being stewards. So when in Genesis we read that we are to rule over or we are to be stewards of God's creation, I hope what I've managed to share with you today is an example of how, as a professional forester, as a Christian, I've sought to be able to do that with my own patch. And I think I would want to encourage you that your Forestry Commission, in the way that we oversee our own woodlands, like the Forest of Dean or the New Forest or Thetford Chase, and the way that we oversee forest law in terms of what can be done with felling licenses and management and so on, that on the whole, the Forestry Commission is one of the best stewards of the National Forest estate, but when set against, say, the forest services of America or France or Germany and so on. The fact that in the last 100 years, we have increased by 2.5-fold the area of woodland in Britain, from a low of just 5% forest cover to around 13% today. And that today, as we launch the England Trees Action Plan, we will see further afforestation, mainly with broadleaf trees, though we've got to get on top of the skirt of grey squirrels if we're going to deliver good woodlands. But sorry, I must end that little bit of plug or advertorial. Now, sorry, as I was giving this talk, I'm afraid a wood of our own, getting started to go in your own, or getting started in your own wood is available for sale, but a wood of our own is now out of print. And of course, you all know about God's trees, or at least those of you who've been in on my previous talks. And Julian and I were wondering whether we might revisit my God's Trees talk perhaps in a year's time. And perhaps there'll be others who will be interested in coming. But if you want to get in touch with me, don't use the contact at the bottom of this slide, but do contact Julian Pym of Worldwide Christian Travel. He can then pass on any contacts back to me, because there are really two things. One, just to remind you that along with Mark Roberts and Sharon of Day One, in May, 2 years' time, in 2 years this month, I'll be jointly leading a tour to Israel, and Julian has put on the contact for that. But also, if you think a few of you, and we can have a group of up to about 20, is probably workable, you'd actually like to visit my wood, we could certainly organize. A visit takes about a couple of hours, but of course, I'd have to ask you to bring your own packed lunches and all that sort of thing. And there's no formal toilet facilities within the wood. So you'd need to go on the way when you come and that sort of thing. But anyway, back to what the woodland looks like today. A beautiful picture of a beech woodland. And I'm just so privileged to be able to share it with you today.